I was in my kitchen in Connecticut staring at my phone, feeling this pit in my stomach because Susan hadn't answered my calls for days. I'd been dialing her number over and over, leaving voicemails that went unanswered, sending texts that sat unread. My son Roger, her husband, was stationed in Germany, serving in the military, and I was the one supposed to keep things together back home. Susan was 9 months pregnant, due any moment, and the silence was driving me up the wall. I kept telling myself she was probably just tired, maybe her phone was dead, maybe she was napping, but none of it felt right. Something was off, and I couldn't shake the dread creeping up my spine. Then my phone buzzed, and I nearly dropped it. It was a text from my friend Linda, who works at the hospital. "Barbara, Susan had the baby. Why aren't you here?" My world stopped. She had the baby. My grandson was born, and nobody told me I was sitting here like a fool, completely clueless, while my family was changing forever. I grabbed my keys, my purse, and the blanket I'd spent 3 months knitting for the baby, every stitch, a promise of love for this child I hadn't even met. My hands were shaking as I locked the door, my mind a mess of questions. Why didn't Susan call? Was she okay? Was the baby okay? I got in the car and drove to the hospital, my foot heavy on the gas, weaving through traffic like I was chasing something I couldn't name. The blanket was on the passenger seat, soft and blue, and I kept glancing at it, thinking about how I'd imagined wrapping my grandson in it, telling him how much his grandma loved him. Now all I could think was how I'd been left out, how I didn't even know his name. When I got to the hospital, I parked so crooked I took up 2 spaces, but I didn't care. I ran to the maternity ward, clutching that blanket like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. The nurse at the desk looked up as I stumbled in, out of breath, my hair a mess. "I'm here to see Susan," I said, my voice cracking. "She's my daughter-in-law. She just had her baby." The nurse tapped on her keyboard, her face blank, then looked at me like I was some kind of intruder. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're not on the approved visitor list. Susan specifically requested no visitors except immediate family." I stared at her, not comprehending. "I am her family. I'm her mother-in-law. My son's her husband." The nurse shook her head, her voice flat. She was very clear. "You're not allowed in." It was like someone had punched me in the chest. Susan had banned me. My own daughter-in-law had put me on some kind of blacklist, like I was a nobody, like I didn't belong in my own grandson's life. I wanted to scream, to demand, to see her to push past that nurse and storm into the room, but my legs felt like jelly. I stumbled to a chair in the waiting area just outside the maternity ward and collapsed the blanket heavy in my lap. I sat there staring at the door. I wasn't allowed to walk through my mind, spinning. I thought about Roger, my boy out there in Germany, probably just as clueless as I was. Did he know his son was born? Did Susan tell him and leave me out on purpose? Or was he in the dark too? This anger started bubbling up, not just at Susan, but at myself for not seeing this coming, for not realizing something was so broken between us, that she'd do this. Before I dive into this story, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment with where you're watching from. Your support means everything. I'm Barbara, 67 years old, and this is the story of how my world flipped upside down the day my grandson was born. I sat in that waiting room for hours watching families come and go, their arms full of balloons and flowers, their faces glowing with happiness. Every time the maternity ward door swung open, I'd sit up hoping maybe Susan had changed her mind, maybe she'd sent someone to get me. But nobody came. I kept replaying every moment I'd had with her, searching for the moment I'd messed up. Was it something I said? Something I didn't do? Susan and I were never close, like some mothers and daughters-in-law, but I thought we were okay. I'd been there for her when Roger deployed, dropping by with food, offering to help with errands, checking in to make sure she was holding up. She'd always been polite, maybe a little reserved, but I chalked it up to her being private. Never in my wildest dreams did I think she'd cut me out like this, like I was nothing. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Linda. "You okay? I saw you in the waiting room. Want me to come sit with you?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to beg her to come, to have someone hold my hand through this, but another part of me was too humiliated. Humiliated that my own family had shut me out, that I was sitting there like some kind of reject. I texted back, "I'm fine. Just need to think." But I wasn't fine. I was unraveling. I looked down at the blanket, running my fingers over the yarn, and thought about all the nights I'd sat up knitting it, picturing the moment I'd hand it to Susan, see her smile, watch her wrap the baby in it. Now it felt like a cruel joke, like all that love I'd put into it was wasted. I don't know how long I was there. 3 hours, maybe 4, when a doctor walked out and glanced my way. I stood up thinking maybe he had news, but he just nodded and kept going. That's when it hit me that I couldn't stay there forever, just sitting like some lost puppy. I had to do something. I pulled out my phone and called Roger's base in Germany. It took forever to get through, jumping from one operator to another, but finally I heard his voice. "Mom, what's going on? You sound upset," he said, the connection crackling. I took a deep breath and spilled everything. How Susan had the baby, how I found out from Linda how I'd been banned from seeing her or the baby. There was a long silence. And then he said, "She didn't tell me either." My heart shattered for him. My boy out there serving his country didn't even know his son was born. I could hear the pain in his voice, but he tried to keep it together. "I'll call her, Mom. I'll figure this out." After we hung up, I felt a tiny bit of relief, like maybe Roger could fix this, like maybe he'd talk to Susan and make her see how wrong this was. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I looked at the blanket again, tracing the stitches, and made a decision. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. I'd waited for Roger through basic training, through every deployment, through every hard moment of his life. I could wait now too. I folded the blanket, tucked it into my bag, and walked out of the hospital, my head high even though I felt like I was falling apart inside. When I got home, I sent Roger a text. I didn't go in because I was banned. But I was there like I always am for you, standing behind you, quiet but strong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Susan, about what could have pushed her to do this. I started digging through old texts, old emails, looking for anything that might explain it. There was nothing obvious, no big argument, no moment where I could point and say, this is where it went wrong. But there were small things, moments I'd brushed off at the time. Like when she'd snap at me for asking too many questions about the pregnancy, or when she'd cancel plans at the last minute with some vague excuse. I thought she was just stressed, but now those moments felt like warnings I'd ignored. I started wondering if this was about more than just me. Maybe she was struggling with Roger being gone, with the weight of becoming a mom. Maybe she felt alone and didn't know how to reach out. Or maybe she just didn't want me in her life, and that was the hardest pill to swallow. The next morning I woke up exhausted but determined. I wasn't going to let this sit. I called Linda, hoping she could give me more details. "I don't know much," she said. "Susan came in, had the baby, and made it clear she didn't want visitors. I only texted you because I thought you should know." I thanked her and hung up, feeling that anger flare up again. I wanted to march over to Susan's house, bang on the door, and demand answers. But I knew that wouldn't help. Instead, I started reaching out to other people, mutual friends, Susan's coworkers, even her mom who lived in Rhode Island. Nobody had much to say. Susan's mom was polite but cold, saying Susan's just overwhelmed. Give her time. Time for what? To keep me locked out forever. I wasn't going to wait around for her to decide I was worthy of being a grandma. I decided to do something practical. I put together a care package, diapers, baby clothes, a couple of casseroles I'd made, and drove to Susan's house. I didn't knock, didn't try to see her. I just left it on the porch and texted her, "I'm here if you need me." No pressure. I didn't expect a response and I didn't get one, but it felt better than doing nothing. I kept thinking about Roger, about how he was stuck in Germany trying to deal with this from thousands of miles away. I called him again that afternoon and he sounded drained. "I talked to Susan," he said. "She's not giving me much. She says she just needed space, but I don't know, Mom. I'm trying to get leave, but it's a mess." I told him to focus on his job, that I'd handle things here, even though I had no idea how. Over the next few days, I kept up the care packages, dropping them off every other day. I'd include little things, a pacifier, a rattle, a note, saying I was thinking of them. Susan never responded, but I didn't stop. I also started talking to Linda more, asking her to keep an eye out at the hospital to let me know if anything changed. She'd give me small updates. Susan had been discharged, the baby was healthy, but that was it. I felt like I was grasping at straws trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Every night I'd take out that blanket, hold it, and pray that one day I'd get to use it, that I'd get to be the grandma I'd always wanted to be. By the end of the week, I was worn out, but I wasn't giving up. I kept thinking about Ethan, my grandson out there in the world, and how I hadn't even seen his face. I started planning my next move, maybe a letter, maybe showing up at Susan's house, maybe getting Roger to talk to her again. I didn't know what would work, but I knew I couldn't let this go. I'd fought for my family before, and I'd fight for it now, no matter how long it took. It had been 2 weeks since Susan had. Ethan and I was still on the outside staring at a wall I couldn't climb. I'd been leaving care packages at her doorstep, diapers, baby clothes, homemade meals, hoping each one might chip away at whatever was keeping her from letting me in. But there was nothing. No calls, no texts, not even a thank you. It was like I was shouting into a void. Roger was still in Germany, stuck in military red tape, trying to get emergency leave to come home. He'd call every few days, his voice heavy, saying things like, "I don't know what's wrong with her, Mom. She's shutting me out too." It killed me to hear him so lost, my boy who'd always been so strong, now caught between his duty and his family. I wanted to fix it for him, for all of us, but I didn't know where to start. I was at home one morning folding that knitted blanket I'd made for Ethan when my phone rang. It was Linda, my friend from the hospital, her voice low and urgent. "Barbara, I shouldn't be telling you this, but Susan's back at the hospital. Ethan's got an infection, and she's there alone. I thought you'd want to know?" My heart sank, but I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, tucked the blanket inside, and drove to the hospital, my mind racing with worry. Ethan was sick. My grandson, who I hadn't even met, was fighting something, and Susan was dealing with it by herself. I wasn't going to let some nurses list stop me this time. I was going to be there whether Susan wanted me or not. When I got to the pediatric ward, I saw Susan through the glass window of Ethan's room. She was sitting by his crib, her head in her hands, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Ethan was tiny, hooked up to monitors, his little body wrapped in a thin hospital blanket. I took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and walked in, bracing myself for a fight. Susan looked up, her eyes red and swollen, and for a split second I thought she'd tell me to get out. But she didn't. She just stared like she was too exhausted to argue. "Susan, I'm not here to make trouble," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I just want to help. Let me sit with you." She didn't respond, just looked back at Ethan. I took that as a sign and pulled up a chair next to her. We sat there in silence for what felt like forever. The only sound, the steady beep of Ethan's monitors. I wanted to ask her why she'd banned me, what I'd done to make her hate me, but this wasn't the time. This was about Ethan, about being there for him. Finally, Susan spoke, her voice so soft I barely heard her. "His name's Ethan. He got a fever a few days ago and they don't know why." I nodded, my eyes on my grandson. "Ethan. He had a name and it made him real, like a piece of my heart I'd been missing. He's strong," I said. "He's got Roger's fight in him." Susan glanced at me and I saw something shift in her eyes. Maybe fear, maybe relief. I couldn't tell, but it was something. Over the next few hours, we started talking not about the big stuff, but about Ethan, how he'd make these little grunting noises in his sleep, how his fingers would curl around your thumb. I told her about Roger when he was a baby, how he'd been stubborn from day one, always fighting to get what he wanted. She listened and I could feel a tiny crack forming in the wall between us. When the doctor came in with an update, Ethan's fever was dropping, but he'd need to stay a few more days. Susan turned to me and said, "Will you stay just for a bit?" My throat tightened, but I nodded. "Of course." I stayed at the hospital all day, doing whatever I could to make things easier. I ran to the cafeteria for coffee, drove to Susan's house to pick up clean clothes, even sat with Ethan while she took a quick shower in the hospital bathroom. She didn't say much, but she didn't push me away either. It wasn't a big moment, no tearful apologies or heartfelt talks, but it was something. When I finally went home that night, I felt a flicker of hope, like maybe we were turning a corner. I called Roger and told him everything about Ethan's infection, about Susan letting me stay. "That's good, Mom," he said, sounding relieved. "Keep being there. I'm still working on getting home." But the next day when I got back to the hospital, Susan was different. She was polite, but there was a wall up again, like she'd regretted letting me in. "Thanks for yesterday," she said, not looking at me. But I've got this now. You don't need to keep coming. It stung like a slap I didn't see coming. I wanted to argue to tell her I wasn't going anywhere, but I could see she was closing off. So I nodded, left another care package by her chair, some snacks, a few baby onesies, and walked out. It hurt, but I wasn't giving up. I'd seen that crack in her armor, and I was going to keep pushing. Over the next week, I stayed away from the hospital, respecting Susan's request, but I didn't stop showing up in other ways. I kept dropping off care packages at her house, texting her to check in, even mailed a little card with a picture of Roger as a baby, hoping it'd remind her we were family. I didn't get much back, just a couple of short thanks texts, but I kept going. I started calling Linda more, asking for updates on Ethan. She'd tell me he was getting better, that his fever was gone, but Susan was still a wreck, barely sleeping, barely eating. I wished I could do more, but I didn't want to push too hard and ruin whatever progress we'd made. One afternoon I was at the grocery store picking up stuff for another care package when I ran into Susan's friend Emily. She'd been at Susan's baby shower, and I remembered her being close with her. "How's Susan holding up?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Emily hesitated, then said she's struggling. She won't admit it, but she's overwhelmed. Roger being gone is hitting her hard. I nodded, thanking her, and left the store with a new plan. If Susan was struggling, maybe I could help without being in her face. I started including little things in the care packages that weren't just for Ethan: face masks, a journal, a gift card for coffee. I'd write notes saying, "Take care of yourself too." I didn't know if it was helping, but it was all I could think to do. Then Roger called with big news: he'd gotten his leave approved. He was coming home in 3 days. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, like maybe he could get through to Susan, figure out what was really going on. I spent those 3 days getting ready, cleaning my house, stocking the fridge with Roger's favorite foods, setting up a little corner in the living room with baby stuff, diapers, wipes, that knitted blanket. I kept imagining the moment he'd walk through the door, how maybe he'd bring Susan and Ethan with him, how he'd finally start acting like a family. But I also knew it wouldn't be that simple. Susan was still keeping me at a distance, and I didn't know if Roger's return would change that. When Roger's plane landed, I was at the airport, my heart pounding as I scanned the crowd. When I saw him, tall and tired in his uniform, I ran to him, wrapping him in a hug. "Thanks for holding it together, Mom," he said, his voice rough. We drove straight to Susan's house, and when she opened the door, I saw her face soften for the first time in weeks. She threw her arms around Roger, and I stood back, giving them their moment. Ethan was asleep in his crib inside, and I finally got to see him up close, his tiny nose, his little hands curled into fists. I didn't touch him, didn't want to overstep, but just seeing him made my chest ache with love. Roger spent the next few days trying to talk to Susan, but it wasn't easy. He'd call me with updates saying she was stressed, maybe dealing with postpartum stuff. "She's not herself, Mom," he said. "She's not talking much, even to me." I wanted to tell him to push harder, to demand answers, but I didn't. Instead, I kept doing what I'd been doing, dropping off packages, texting Susan to let her know I was there, praying she'd let me in. One evening, I brought over a lasagna and left it on the porch like always. But this time Susan texted me back, "Thanks, Barbara. Roger's eating it now." It was small, but it felt like a step. I started spending more time with Roger when he'd come by my house. He'd tell me about his calls with Susan, how she'd open up 1 minute and shut down the next. "I don't know what she's scared of," he said one night sitting at my kitchen table. "But I'm not giving up." I nodded, pouring him another coffee. "Neither am I." We talked about Ethan, about how Roger wanted to be there for every moment, about how he was already planning to teach him how to throw a baseball. It was the first time in weeks I'd felt like we were a team, like we were fighting for the same thing. By the end of the week, Roger was starting to wear Susan down. He'd convinced her to let me come over for a short visit just to see Ethan. When I walked into their house, Susan was holding him, and she gave me a small smile. "He's been fussy today," she said, handing him to me. I held my grandson for the first time, his weight so light in my arms, and I felt tears prick my eyes. I didn't say anything, just rocked him gently, memorizing his face. Susan watched us, and I could tell she was still guarded, but she didn't stop me. It was a start, and I was going to hold on to it with everything I had. Roger had been home for a week, and things were still shaky. Susan was letting him be there for Ethan, changing diapers and rocking him to sleep, but with me she was still holding back, keeping me at a distance like I was a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I'd get these short visits, maybe 30 minutes at their house, where Roger would hand me Ethan, and I'd hold my grandson, feeling his little heartbeat against my chest, memorizing every inch of his face, his big eyes, his tiny nose, the way his lips twitched like he was dreaming. Those moments were everything, but Susan never joined us. She'd stay in the kitchen or slip into another room, and I could feel the weight of her absence. Roger was trying to bridge the gap, but it was slow going. He'd call me after every visit, sounding worn out. "She's still not ready, Mom," he'd say. "She's got stuff going on, but she won't talk about it." I wanted to push to demand why she was still icing me out, but Roger kept asking me to be patient. "Just give her time," he'd say, and I'd bite my tongue even though it felt like time was slipping away. I was at home one evening folding laundry and thinking about Ethan when my phone rang. It was Roger, his voice low and tense. "Mom, can you come over? Susan wants to talk." All of us. My stomach flipped. This was it. Either we were going to fix this or it was going to explode. I grabbed my keys, my hands shaking as I locked the door, and drove to their house in Connecticut, the streetlights blurring past me. My mind was racing, trying to prepare for whatever was coming. Was Susan going to tell me to back off for good? Or was she finally going to let me in? I kept thinking about that knitted blanket still in my bag, and how I'd been carrying it around like a lifeline, hoping one day I'd get to wrap Ethan in it. For real. When I pulled up to their house, the porch light was on, and Roger was waiting at the door. He gave me a quick hug, his face tight with nerves. "She's ready to talk," he said, leading me inside. Susan was on the couch, Ethan asleep in his bassinet next to her, his little chest rising and falling. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes puffy like she'd been crying. I sat across from her in an armchair, my hands clasped in my lap, waiting for her to start. Roger paced behind the couch like he couldn't sit still. The air felt heavy, like we were all holding our breath. Susan took a deep breath and looked at me, her eyes tired but steady. "Barbara, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I didn't tell you about Ethan being born because I was scared. Not of you, but of everything." Roger was gone. I was alone, and I felt like I was falling apart. I didn't know how to handle it, so I pushed everyone away, especially you. I sat there trying to take it in my mind, scrambling to make sense of her words. "Why me?" I asked, keeping my voice calm even though my chest was tight. "What did I do to make you think you couldn't trust me?" Susan looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together. "It wasn't about you, not really. It was about me. My mom and I have a bad history. She was always controlling, always telling me what to do, and I guess I was afraid you'd be like that too. I know it's not fair, but when I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I didn't want anyone telling me how to raise my kid, how to be a mom. So I shut you out." Her voice cracked, and I could see her fighting to keep it together. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just didn't know how to let you in." I listened, letting her words sink in. Part of me wanted to be angry, to tell her how much she'd hurt me, how she'd made me feel like I was nothing, sitting in that hospital waiting room, banned from my own grandson's life. But another part of me saw a young woman who was terrified, who was trying to protect herself and her baby the only way she knew how. I thought about my own mom, how she'd been tough on me, always pushing, and how I'd sworn I'd be different with Roger. Maybe Susan was trying to do the same in her own messy, complicated way. Roger stopped pacing and spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. "Susan, you should have told me. I could have helped. Mom could have helped." Susan nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm still figuring this out." I reached out and put my hand on hers, surprising myself with the gesture. "We're family," I said, my voice steady. "We figure it out together. I'm not here to control you. I just want to love Ethan and you, if you'll let me." She looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of trust, like a door cracking open just a little. That night was a turning point, but it wasn't like everything was fixed. Susan didn't suddenly become my best friend, and I didn't expect her to. But she started letting me in bit by bit. The next day I went over to their house with another care package, some baby formula, a few onesies, and a coffee gift card for Susan. She invited me in something she'd never done before, and we sat at her kitchen table while Ethan napped. She didn't say much, but she asked me about Roger as a baby, what he was like if he was as fussy as Ethan. I told her stories how Roger would only sleep if I rocked him for hours, how he'd giggle at the sound of my old radio. She listened, even laughed a little, and it felt like we were building something even if it was fragile. Over the next few days, I started coming over more, helping with Ethan. When Susan needed a break, I'd change his diapers, give him a bottle, or just hold him while she took a nap. She'd thank me, her voice quiet, and I could tell she was still figuring out how to trust me. Roger was there too, doing his part, but he was also getting ready to go back to Germany, which hung over us like a cloud. One afternoon, while I was rocking Ethan in their living room, Susan sat down across from me and handed me that knitted blanket, the one I'd left at the hospital all those weeks ago. "I kept it," she said, her eyes on Ethan. "I didn't know if I'd ever give it back, but I'm glad I did." I wrapped Ethan in it, my throat tight, and for the first time I felt like I was really his grandma. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Roger and I talked a lot during those days, usually late at night when Susan was asleep. He'd tell me how he was trying to get Susan to open up more, how he was worried about leaving her again. "She's strong, Mom," he said one night, sitting on my porch with a beer in his hand. "But she's scared and I don't know how to fix it." I nodded, thinking about how scared I'd been when Roger was born, how I'd felt so alone sometimes. "You don't fix it," I said. "You just keep showing up." He looked at me and I could see he was carrying the weight of it all, his wife, his son, his job. I wanted to take that weight from him, but all I could do was be there. Susan started asking me to do small things, pick up groceries, watch Ethan while she ran to the pharmacy. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. One day she called me out of the blue, her voice shaky. "Barbara, Ethan's got a rash, and I don't know if it's serious. Can you come over?" I was there in 15 minutes, and we sat together looking at the red spots on Ethan's tummy, deciding whether to call the doctor. It turned out to be nothing, just a heat rash, but the fact that she'd called me meant everything. I didn't say that out loud, didn't want to make it a big deal, but I went home that night and cried, feeling like maybe we were finally getting somewhere. Roger's leave was running out, and I could tell Susan was dreading his departure. She'd get quiet when he talked about going back, and I'd catch her staring at Ethan with this look of panic, like she didn't know how she'd do it alone. I started spending more time at their house, helping with chores, making sure Susan had one less thing to worry about. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, she said, "I don't know how I'm going to do this without Roger." It was the most vulnerable she'd ever been with me, and I didn't push. I just said, "You're not alone, Susan. I'm here." She nodded and we kept washing dishes, the silence between us softer than it had ever been. By the end of Roger's leave, Susan and I had a rhythm. It wasn't perfect. She'd still have moments where she'd pull back, where I'd feel that wall go up, but we were talking, working together, raising Ethan as a team. Roger noticed it too. The night before he left, he pulled me aside. "You're doing good, Mom," he said. "She's starting to trust you." I hugged him tight, praying he was right, praying this fragile thing we were building would hold. When he left for Germany the next morning, I drove him to the airport, and we didn't say much, just sat in the quiet, knowing we were both fighting for the same thing, our family. Roger was gone again, back to his base in Germany, and I knew the weight of his absence was going to hit Susan hard. She'd opened up to me over the past few weeks, letting me into her and Ethan's world bit by bit, but she was still fragile, still navigating the chaos of being a new mom without her husband. I made a promise to myself that I'd be there not just for Ethan but for her too, no matter how small the gesture. I started coming over to their house in Connecticut a few times a week, helping with whatever she needed, washing bottles, folding tiny onesies, or just sitting with her while she vented about how overwhelming it all was. She'd talk about missing Roger, about how Ethan's cries kept her up all night, about how she was terrified of doing something wrong. I'd listen, share stories of my own from when Roger was a baby, and try to show her she wasn't alone in this. The first few days after Roger left, Susan was quiet, almost like she was retreating again. I'd show up with a care package, some muffins, a new pacifier for Ethan, a little note saying, "I was thinking of them," and she'd thank me but keep her distance. I didn't push, just kept showing up, hoping consistency would prove I wasn't going anywhere. One morning, I brought over a pot of chicken soup, knowing she hadn't been eating much. When I set it on her kitchen counter, she looked at it for a long moment, then said, You don't have to keep doing this, Barbara. Her voice wasn't cold, just tired. I shrugged and said, I know, but I want to. She nodded, and for the first time, she invited me to stay for a cup of coffee. We sat at her table, Ethan napping in his swing, and talked about nothing important. Grocery lists, the weather, Ethan's latest obsession with grabbing his toes. It was small, but it felt like a step forward. I started taking Ethan for a few hours here and there, giving Susan a chance to rest or run errands. I'd bring him to my house, set up a blanket on the living room floor, and let him kick his little legs while I showed him Roger's old toys, a rattle that still jingled a stuffed bear with one eye missing. I'd tell him stories about his dad, about how Roger used to climb everything as a toddler, how he'd always been fearless. Sometimes Susan would come with us, and we'd sit in my backyard watching Ethan wiggle in the grass, talking about whatever came to mind. She'd ask me questions about raising Roger, like what I did when he wouldn't sleep or how I handled his tantrums. I'd answer honestly, admitting my mistakes, and she'd listen, her guard lowering a little more each time. One day, Susan called me, her voice as a taunt. Barbara, I've got a doctor's appointment for Ethan tomorrow. Can you come with me? I just want someone there in case I miss something. I didn't let her see how much that meant to me, just said, of course I'll be there. The next morning I met her at the pediatrician's office, and we sat in the waiting room, Ethan babbling in his stroller. Susan was nervous, fidgeting with her phone, so I kept the conversation light, pointing out Ethan's new trick of blowing spit bubbles. When the doctor called us in, Susan took notes, asking about Ethan's weight, his milestones, while I stayed quiet, just there for support. The doctor said Ethan was growing perfectly, and when he mentioned how much Ethan was eating, I couldn't help but smile. He's got Roger's appetite, I said. Susan laughed a real laugh, and it felt like a win, like we were finally on the same team. As the weeks turned into months, Susan and I found a rhythm. I'd come over to help with Ethan cook dinner, or just hang out while she took a shower. She started calling me more, not just for emergencies, but for little things, like when Ethan rolled over for the first time, or when she needed advice about a rash. We'd laugh over his silly faces, swap stories about Roger's childhood, and slowly it felt like we were building something solid. There were still days when Susan would get quiet, when I'd sense that wall going up, but I'd learned to give her space, to let her come back when she was ready. I kept that knitted blanket at her house now, draped over Ethan's crib, and every time I saw it I felt a quiet pride, like it was a symbol of how far we'd come. One weekend I suggested we take Ethan to a baby music class at the community center, thinking it'd be good for both of them. Susan was hesitant at first, saying she wasn't sure she was up for it, but I convinced her to try. We sat on the floor with a dozen other moms and babies clapping along to silly songs, and Ethan loved it, flapping his arms like he was conducting the music. Susan started to relax, even singing along quietly, and when one of the other moms complimented Ethan's chubby cheeks, Susan smiled and said he gets that from his dad. On the way home, she thanked me, saying it was the first time in weeks she'd felt normal. I didn't make a big deal of it, but inside I was beaming. We started doing more together, trips to the park where we'd push Ethan in the baby swing, or quick runs to the store where I'd carry him while Susan grabbed what she needed. One Saturday, I convinced her to come with me to my sister's house in Massachusetts for the weekend. My sister Diane had been dying to meet Ethan, and I thought it'd be good for Susan to get out of Connecticut for a bit. We packed up the car with diapers, bottles, and that blanket, and drove up, Ethan sleeping most of the way. Diane's house was loud and chaotic, with her grandkids running around, but Susan handled it like a pro, chatting with Diane, even laughing when one of the kids tried to borrow Ethan's rattle. That night, as we sat on Diane's porch, Susan said, "This was nice. I didn't realize how much I needed it." I just nodded, not wanting to ruin the moment by saying too much. Roger would call when he could, usually late at night, when Ethan was asleep. I'd fill him in on everything: how Ethan was starting to sit up, how Susan was letting me help more, how we were finding our way. He'd laugh, saying, "Sounds like you two are ganging up on me already." But I could hear the relief in his voice, knowing his family was okay while he was so far away. He started talking about his next leave, maybe even bringing Susan and Ethan to Germany for a while. The thought of them being across the ocean made my chest tighten, but I knew it was what they needed. I'd miss Ethan's giggles, Susan's quiet smiles, but I wanted them to be together, to be a family. Susan started inviting me in more, not just dropping off packages and leaving. She'd offer me coffee, ask me to stay while she fed Ethan, even show me pictures she'd taken of him on her phone. One day she handed me a photo she'd printed, a blurry shot of Ethan smiling wrapped in that knitted blanket. "I thought you'd like it," she said, almost shy. I tucked it into my purse, fighting back tears, and thanked her. It was small, but it felt like a gift, like she was saying, "I was part of this now." As Ethan got bigger, hitting milestones like grabbing toys and babbling nonsense, every moment felt precious. I'd wrap him in that blanket whenever I could, telling Susan how I'd spent 3 months knitting it, how every stitch was for him. She'd smile, saying, "He loves that thing. Won't sleep without it." Those words were like gold proof that I'd made something lasting, something that mattered. Susan was loosening up, trusting me more, and I was learning to follow her lead, to not push too hard. I'd still bring care packages sometimes, but now they were more for fun little toys. For Ethan, a new mug; for Susan, with a cheesy "Best Mom" slogan. She'd roll her eyes but keep them, and I'd catch her using that mug days later. One evening, while we were at her house, Ethan asleep in his crib, Susan opened up more than she ever had. We were sipping tea at her kitchen table, the house quiet, except for the hum of the baby monitor. "I was so scared when Roger left," she said, staring into her cup. "I thought I'd mess everything up, that I couldn't do this without him. And I didn't know how to let you help." I listened, letting her talk, not jumping in with advice. "You're doing it," I said when she paused. "You're a great mom, Susan. And I'm here when you need me." She looked at me, her eyes soft, and nodded. "I know. Thank you." By the time Ethan was nearing his first birthday, Susan and I were in a good place. We weren't just mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, we were partners raising this little boy together while Roger was away. I knew Roger's return would change things again, that Susan and Ethan might join him in Germany someday, but I wasn't afraid anymore. We'd built something strong, something that could stretch across oceans. Every time I held Ethan wrapped in that blanket or saw Susan smile at one of my silly jokes, I knew we'd be okay. We were family, and that was enough. Ethan was turning 1, and Susan and I had come a long way from those dark days when I was banned from the hospital, clutching that knitted blanket like it was all I had left. We'd built something real in Connecticut, a partnership forged through late-night feedings, shared worries, and quiet moments where we'd laugh over Ethan's latest antics. We weren't just mother-in-law and daughter-in-law anymore. We were a team raising this little boy together while Roger was still in Germany. For Ethan's first birthday, we decided to throw a big party at my house, something to celebrate, not just him, but everything we'd overcome. I wanted it to be perfect, a day where we could all feel like family, no walls, no distance. Susan was on board, and we spent days planning balloons, a cake with blue frosting, a playlist of kid songs mixed with Roger's favorite old rock tunes. The morning of the party, Susan came over early, Ethan in her arms, his little party hat already slipping off his head. We worked side by side in my kitchen decorating the house, while Ethan babbled in his high chair, smacking his hands on the tray. Susan was stringing up streamers, her hair falling in her face, and I was icing cupcakes, trying not to get blue frosting everywhere. "He's going to destroy that cake, isn't he?" Susan said, glancing at Ethan with a grin. I laughed, picturing his chubby hands smashing into it. "Oh, he's Roger's son, it's guaranteed." For a moment, we were just two women planning a party, no baggage, no tension, and it felt so good, like we'd finally found our footing. Guests started arriving: my sister Diane, some of Susan's friends, a few neighbors who'd watched Roger grow up. The house was loud, filled with laughter and the squeals of other kids running around. Susan was nervous at first, sticking close to Ethan, but I saw her relax as the day went on, chatting with people, even joking with Diane about Ethan's obsession with pulling her dog's tail. Roger couldn't be there, but we set up a laptop in the living room for a video call. When his face popped up on the screen, Ethan clapped his hands like he knew it was his dad. Roger sang happy birthday from thousands of miles away, his voice crackling but strong, and I saw Susan wipe her eyes, smiling through it. I stood back, watching my family, imperfect, scattered across the world, but together in that moment. When it was time for the cake, we all gathered around the table, Ethan in his high chair looking confused by the candle flickering in front of him. Susan and I leaned in, helping him blow it out, and the room erupted in cheers. Then Ethan dove in, grabbing fistfuls of cake, smearing blue frosting all over his face. Susan and I lost it, laughing so hard we could barely breathe, tears streaming down our faces. I grabbed my phone, snapping pictures, knowing I'd send them to Roger later. It was messy, chaotic, and perfect, exactly what I'd hoped for. As the party wound down, guests leaving with hugs and promises to meet up again, Susan and I cleaned up, scraping, frosting off the table, stacking plates in the sink. Ethan was asleep in his stroller, still clutching a piece of balloon string wrapped in that knitted blanket I'd made. When the house was quiet, just the two of us left, Susan sat on my couch, Ethan snoring softly beside her. She looked at me, her face soft in the dim light. "I'm glad you didn't give up on me," she said, her voice low. "I know I made it hard, but you kept showing up." I smiled, reaching over to tuck the blanket around Ethan's shoulders. "Your family," I said. "That's what we do." She nodded, and we sat there for a while, not saying much, just letting the moment settle. It wasn't a big dramatic scene, but it was everything, proof that we'd made it through the worst, that we'd built something that could last. A few months later, Roger got word that he'd be coming home for good. His tour was ending, and he'd be back in Connecticut, ready to start the next chapter with Susan and Ethan. The news hit me with a mix of joy and nerves. I was thrilled for them, for Roger to finally be with his son every day, for Susan to have her husband back. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little scared. Susan and I had found this rhythm, this way of leaning on each other, and I didn't know what would happen when Roger stepped back in. Would she still need me? Would I still get to hold Ethan, tell him stories, wrap him in that blanket? I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the good, on the fact that my family was coming together. Susan was a wreck in the days leading up to Roger's return, buzzing with excitement but also anxiety. She'd call me asking if I thought the house was ready, if she'd forgotten anything Roger might need. I'd go over, help her organize, reassure her that it didn't have to be perfect. One afternoon, while we were folding Roger's clothes, she admitted she was nervous about being a military wife again, about adjusting to him being home after so long apart. "It's going to be different," she said, her hands pausing on a shirt. "I got used to doing this alone with you." I nodded, understanding more than I could say. "You'll figure it out," I told her. "And I'm not going anywhere." She gave me a small smile, and I knew she believed me. The day Roger came home, I drove to the airport with Susan and Ethan. Susan was quiet, holding Ethan tight, her leg bouncing as we waited at the gate. When Roger walked out in his uniform, looking tired but grinning, Susan ran to him, Ethan in her arms, and they hugged like they'd never let go. I hung back, giving them their moment, my heart full watching them. Ethan reached for Roger and he lifted him high, laughing as Ethan squealed. It was the kind of scene I dreamed of, my family whole again. Roger caught my eye over Susan's shoulder and mouthed, "Thanks, Mom." I nodded, blinking back tears, knowing he meant for everything, for holding things together, for not giving up. Later at their house, Roger pulled me aside while Susan was putting Ethan down for a nap. "You held it all together," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how you did it, but thank you." I hugged him, feeling the weight of the past year, the hurt, the fight, the slow rebuilding. "You're my boy," I said. "I'd do it 1,000 times. He smiled, and for a moment it was just us, like when he was a kid, before deployments and babies and all the complications of life. In the weeks that followed, things shifted, as I knew they would. Roger took over a lot of what I'd been doing: diaper changes, late-night feedings, trips to the park with Ethan. Susan leaned on him, and I stepped back, letting them find their new normal. But I wasn't shut out. Susan still called me over, asking me to watch Ethan while they ran errands, or inviting me for dinner, where we'd sit around the table passing dishes, laughing at Roger's terrible attempts at cooking. Ethan was walking now, wobbling around on unsteady legs, and I'd chase him through the house, that blanket trailing behind him like a cape. Every time I saw it, I thought about those 3 months. I'd spent knitting it, not knowing if I'd ever get to use it, and I felt grateful for how far we'd come. One evening, Susan and Roger came over to my house, Ethan asleep in his car seat. They sat me down, looking serious, and my stomach twisted, wondering what was coming. Roger spoke first. "We're thinking about moving to Germany for a bit," he said. "There's a chance for me to extend my assignment, and we want Ethan to grow up knowing his dad's world." Susan nodded, adding, "It's not forever, just a couple of years. But we want you to come visit, to be part of it." I took a deep breath, processing. Part of me hated the idea of them being so far away, of missing Ethan's daily milestones, Susan's quiet smiles. But another part of me was proud of Roger for building his career, of Susan for taking this leap, of us for building a bond that could stretch across an ocean. "We'll make it work," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be on that plane as soon as you need me." Susan reached for my hand, squeezing it. "You're always welcome," she said, and I knew she meant it. We spent the rest of the night talking logistics, visas, flights, how often we'd video call. Ethan woke up toddling over to me, and I scooped him up, wrapping him in that blanket. Roger laughed, saying, "That thing's going to Germany too, isn't it?" I nodded, grinning. It's family now. As I sit here now thinking about everything we've been through, I'm grateful for Ethan's giggles, for Susan's trust, for Roger's strength. Grateful for that blanket, for every stitch that kept me going when I thought I'd lost them. We're not perfect. There are still days when Susan and I tiptoe around each other, when Roger's stress makes him snap, when Ethan's tantrums test us all. But we're family, and that's enough. I know the road ahead won't be easy with them. Maybe moving to Germany with all the changes life throws at us. But I've learned something through all this. Family isn't about being there every second, or never fighting or getting it right all the time. It's about showing up even when it's hard, even when you're scared, even when you're not sure you're wanted. I showed up for Susan, for Ethan, for Roger, and they showed up for me. That's what makes us whole. If this story hit you, check out the next one on your screen. Click subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming. Thanks for being here.